What are the objectives of the regulatory regime and what are they trying to achieve?
That's a very good question, and really what I was trying to focus on in my presentation. I talk about the regulatory regime rather than just regulation, because the new regime is much bigger than regulation. And I go back to the beginning and ask a very fundamental question: what are we trying to achieve? What are the objectives? Simplifying, I would say objective number one is to reduce the probability of banks failing. Objective number two is, well, given that banks always will fail, how can we reduce the social costs of those failures? Now, in the past, we've given all of our attention to objective one, capital, liquidity arrangements, all designed to reduce the prospect of banks failing. My argument is, what I actually call in my presentation, the endogeneity problem, if you excuse using a technical term, that you never will achieve objective number one perfectly, because banks always respond. That whatever the regulation is, banks adjust to that. And then the regulator has to adjust to the way that banks have adjusted, and you get a growing quantum of regulation. So given that you can never and never should try to achieve perfection in objective one, for that reason we have to give more focus on objective number two.
And how the banks respond?
Well, financial innovation, the creation of new instruments, are very often actually designed to lower the cost of regulation. And so the reason we have securitization, we used credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, SPVs, SIVs that bankers are very familiar with, they were all created in order to avoid capital regulation imposed by Basel. But unfortunately, all of those actually contributed to the banking crisis. So I think we have to be realistic, and just realistic to know that banks always will respond in a way that makes regulation for objective one extremely difficult.
In an hypothetical point of view, if we can reduce this social cost, we don't need any regulation.
If you go to the extreme, what I call the Alice in Wonderland world, suppose you could reduce the social cost of failure to zero. Of course you can't, but let us just think of it in those terms. Then you wouldn't worry about banks failing. You wouldn't have to bail them out. Therefore, there'd be no cost to the taxpayer. There'd be no moral hazard attached to such intervention. And of course, as you say, ultimately, you wouldn't need any regulation for objective one. Now, that's unrealistic, but at least it demonstrates that we have to look at both objective one and objective two. And they're both very important. I fear most attention is always given to the detail of objective one.
What is the banking union?
The banking union is, well, there have been two major initiatives taken within Europe, and particularly by the European Commission. One is the establishment of a banking union, and the second is a European-wide or EU-wide resolution process. Now, my argument is you need both together. So what we really mean by a banking union is a single regulator, a single resolution authority, a single resolution fund across the EU, a single deposit insurance scheme, and collectivization of risks. Now that's what we actually mean by a banking union. The problem with that is that if you don't also have the resolution, how to deal with banks when they get into difficulty, you won't have a proper, full banking union. And that is why we are giving a lot of attention now to making sure that the EU as a whole has, well, I should say the euro area part of the EU has a single resolution authority. The problem is this is often resisted by the politicians. And the reason for that is simply because it means that that there may be cross-border fiscal transfers. And you then have to ask the question, will taxpayers in country A, B and C be prepared to support the problems of banks in E, F and G? Well, I think there may be some doubt about that. But we have to be clear, a trans-border banking union with resolution does imply cross-border fiscal transfers when banks get into difficulty.